German generals once laughed at American logistics. They mocked U.S. soldiers as soft, careless, and too reliant on machines. But just weeks later, those same generals stood in silence as endless convoys of American trucks thundered past. More trucks than Germany had soldiers. In that moment, they realized the war was already lost, not because of tanks or planes, but because of trucks. And if you want to uncover more hidden stories of history that will shock you, make sure to subscribe to our channel WWII Untold, because this is just the beginning. It was the summer of 1944. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. Patton's Third Army led the charge, but tanks and soldiers need one thing above all: fuel. Without gasoline, the advance would grind to a halt. German commanders knew this. They expected the Americans to stall within days, but the U.S. didn't stop. Instead, they unleashed the greatest logistics operation of the war, a non-stop convoy system known as the Red Ball Express. What began as a temporary fix became the lifeline of the Allied advance, rewriting the rules of modern warfare. German miscalculation. German staff officers, trained in the traditions of European warfare, believed they understood logistics better than anyone. For them, every campaign had a culminating point, the moment when advancing armies stretched their supply lines so thin that progress simply collapsed. They assumed the same fate awaited the Americans. After all, Patton's tanks were burning through fuel faster than anything the Wehrmacht had ever seen. Each Sherman guzzled hundreds of gallons every few days. To the Germans, it was obvious. Patton might thunder forward in the summer of 1944, but before long, his engines would sputter to silence on the empty roads of France. From their perspective, the calculation seemed unshakable. Europe's roads were narrow, its railroads smashed by Allied bombing. Moving supplies hundreds of miles inland was a nightmare even for armies used to operating close to home. The Wehrmacht had struggled with this very problem in Russia, where supply trains could not keep up with advancing panzers. If German armies had been slowed by logistics, surely the Americans, with their so-called soft soldiers and wasteful habits, would suffer even worse. German officers joked that Patton's armored columns would reach the German border, only to grind to a halt, not from enemy fire, but from empty gas tanks. They pictured Sherman crews stranded in the countryside, waiting helplessly for supplies that would never arrive. For Berlin, this was a comforting thought. America's advance, they believed, would collapse under its own weight. But what the Germans had not grasped was the scale of American industry and the willingness to throw everything into solving a problem. While they clung to tradition, the U.S. Army built something completely new. A rolling highway of trucks, the Red Ball Express, that never stopped moving. Fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, everything Patton needed flowed night and day in a supply system. The Germans had no answer for . So while German staff waited for Patton's tanks to stall, the opposite happened. The American advance roared ahead, faster than the Wehrmacht could retreat. And with every mile gained, German generals began to realize their fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated not American courage, not American weapons, but American logistics. Birth of the Red Ball Express. In August 1944, the American army faced a crisis. Patton's tanks were racing across France at a speed no one had predicted. The faster they advanced, the more fuel, ammunition, and food they burned through. Traditional supply methods, railroads and depots, simply couldn't keep up. If the Allies didn't find a solution, the advance would stall, giving Germany precious time to regroup. The answer was as bold as it was simple. Build an entirely new highway system, just for supply trucks. The operation was called the Red Ball Express. Overnight, engineers and military planners transformed the French road network into a one-way loop. Eastbound roads were reserved only for loaded convoys heading toward the front. Westbound routes carried the empty trucks back for another load. Civilian traffic, even Allied military traffic, had to move aside. If a convoy with the Red Ball insignia appeared, it had the right of way, no questions asked. Drivers painted bright red circles, red balls, on their vehicles so there was no mistaking them. These convoys became the lifeline of the advancing armies, roaring down French roads 24 hours a day. Trucks rolled bumper to bumper, headlights blacked out at night, engines straining under massive loads. The system wasn't elegant, and it wasn't efficient by peacetime standards, but it worked. And it worked on a scale that stunned both allies and enemies alike. French villagers watched in awe as endless lines of American trucks thundered past their homes. a moving river of steel and rubber. German commanders, monitoring the operation, were baffled. They had never seen logistics prioritized over everything else in such a radical way. For the Wehrmacht, supply was always a supporting act. For the Americans, supply became the main show. By creating a one-way highway network, the U.S. had done something revolutionary. They had given Patton's tanks an unstoppable flow of fuel and ammunition. Each day, thousands of tons of supplies reached the front, keeping the momentum alive. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a convoy system. It was proof that America had redefined modern warfare. The scale of the Red Ball Express was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Nearly 6,000 trucks hit the roads of France every single day, moving in endless convoys that stretched for miles. Each vehicle had a vital role. Some carried fuel for Patton's hungry tanks. Others hauled ammunition for the artillery, while thousands more delivered rations, spare parts, and even medical supplies for the wounded. It was a non-stop lifeline, keeping an entire army on its feet. At its peak, the numbers grew even higher. More than 7,000 trucks were on the road at the same time, thundering along the one-way highway system that carved across France. To imagine it is staggering, a river of steel and rubber, flowing day and night. Headlights dimmed for secrecy, engines growling through rain, dust, and mud. The sound was constant, like distant thunder that never faded. For the German army, watching this was pure despair. They had spent years perfecting the art of blitzkrieg, lightning war, but their own tanks often starved for fuel or spare parts. Now, the Americans had created something new, logistical blitzkrieg. Instead of panzer divisions, it was convoys of trucks overwhelming the battlefield. And unlike German supply chains, which broke down under strain, the Red Ball Express seemed endless. French civilians described standing at crossroads for hours as convoys roared past without pause. To them, it was the physical embodiment of American power, not just soldiers and tanks, but an entire nation's industry moving on wheels. Every truck symbolized factories back home, workers in Detroit and Pittsburgh, farmers in the Midwest, all united in a single purpose: keep the army moving. The statistics were jaw-dropping. On some days, the convoys delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies. That meant fuel for Patton's Shermans to keep rolling, shells for the artillery to keep firing, and food to keep hundreds of thousands of men fighting. The Red Ball wasn't just transportation. It was the beating heart of the Allied advance. Without it, the drive into Germany would have stalled. With it, the Americans kept pushing forward, powered by an unstoppable army of trucks. The Red Ball Express never slept. The convoys rolled on a relentless schedule, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. To the men who drove those trucks, time blurred into one long road. Sunrises and sunsets meant little. The only constant was the rumble of engines and the pounding of tires against battered roads. Soldiers said the sound never stopped. Even when you tried to rest, the distant growl of trucks echoed through the night, a mechanical heartbeat driving the American advance east. Convoys often stretched as far as the eye could see. From the cab of one truck, you could look ahead and see nothing but taillights vanishing into the horizon. Behind you, more headlights filled the darkness. It was like being part of a moving river, a river of steel and fuel, surging toward the front lines. The pace was brutal. Drivers were ordered to push their machines hard, often with little sleep. Some went 36 hours behind the wheel, guzzling coffee and chain smoking just to stay awake. Fatigue was as much an enemy as the Germans. Drivers told stories of men nodding off mid-route, only to be jolted awake when their trucks veered off into ditches. Others swapped drivers on the fly, one man sliding into the seat without the convoy ever slowing. But the mission came first. Every drum of gasoline, every crate of ammunition, every box of rations mattered. If the trucks stopped, Patton's tanks would grind to a halt, and everyone in those convoys knew it. That urgency kept them going, mile after mile, night after night. To civilians in France, the convoys became a strange new normal. Villagers would lie in bed and listen to the endless roar of trucks on distant highways. Some described it as comforting, the sound of liberation moving east. For German soldiers, though, it was terrifying. That unbroken drone of engines meant the Americans had solved the very problem the Reich believed impossible, sustaining an army deep inside Europe. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous. It was exhausting, dirty, and dangerous. But without those trucks, running every hour of every day, the Allied advance would have stalled in the mud of France. Instead, fueled by that endless roar, Patton's army kept charging forward. If the Red Ball Express had one mission above all, it was fuel. Patton's Third Army was a monster of steel and engines, thousands of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, and supply vehicles, all of them thirsty for gasoline. Without fuel, they were nothing but dead weight. With it, they became an unstoppable spearhead driving into the heart of Europe. The numbers are staggering. Each day, the Red Ball delivered an average of 700,000 gallons of fuel to the front. That's enough to fill more than 40 modern Olympic swimming pools. And it all disappeared as fast as it arrived. Patton's armored divisions burned through fuel at an incredible pace, sometimes guzzling 350,000 gallons in a single day. It wasn't just consumption, it was addiction. His army could not fight, could not move, without that daily lifeline of gasoline. Trucks carrying 5-gallon jerry cans became the unsung heroes of the advance. Convoys packed with fuel drums raced down the highways, every driver knowing that if they failed to deliver, entire divisions would grind to a halt. And halting meant disaster. Stalled tanks were easy prey for German artillery and aircraft. More importantly, losing momentum would give the Wehrmacht time to regroup, dig in, and perhaps even counterattack. For Patton, there was no greater frustration than waiting on fuel. More than once, his tanks stood just miles from breakthroughs, engines silent, crews idle, simply because the gasoline had not yet arrived. But when the Red Ball delivered, the difference was night and day. Engines roared to life, columns of armor thundered forward, and the Germans, already reeling, had no chance to catch their breath. German generals couldn't believe it. They had gambled that American supply lines would collapse under their own weight. They assumed the US could never sustain such a pace so deep inside Europe. And yet, every sunrise proved them wrong. Every day, another 700,000 gallons flowed east, turning Patton's advance into a rolling storm. The Red Ball Express wasn't just moving supplies. It was moving the war itself, pushing the front line closer and closer to Germany, 1 gallon at a time. While the Red Ball Express thundered across France on wheels, the skies above told another story of American power. On some days, U.S. transport planes dropped or delivered more than 2,700 tons of supplies directly to the front. To put that in perspective, this was nearly 10 times what the Luftwaffe managed at Stalingrad, where Germany's grand air supply promise had turned into a humiliating disaster. At Stalingrad, the German High Command had assured its trapped Sixth Army that the Luftwaffe could fly in 300 tons of supplies per day. In reality, most days saw less than 100 tons delivered. Hungry, freezing soldiers waited in vain as the Luftwaffe buckled under Soviet firepower, bad weather, and sheer logistical impossibility. The result was catastrophic. Over 250,000 German troops were cut off and eventually destroyed. The Luftwaffe's failure at Stalingrad became a symbol of Nazi overreach. Bold promises with no ability to deliver. By contrast, the Americans in 1944 had built a logistical machine that actually worked. When trucks couldn't keep up, transport planes filled the gap. C-47 Skytrains, affectionately called Goonie birds, flew around the clock, carrying fuel drums, crates of ammunition, rations, spare parts, and even medical equipment. Airfields in liberated France buzzed with activity, as ground crews worked feverishly to keep the endless chain of flights moving east. For frontline soldiers, the sight of parachutes drifting down with supply loads was more than just resupply. It was hope made visible. Every crate meant another day of fighting, another chance to push further into German-held territory. And unlike the Luftwaffe's failed gamble, the U.S. Army Air Forces delivered consistently, in staggering volume. To German officers, it was infuriating. They had long mocked American reliance on machines and mass production, believing that quantity without quality would crumble under pressure. Yet here was proof that American quantity was not just overwhelming, it was decisive. Every ton of supplies flown in meant Patton's tanks could keep moving, artillery could keep firing, and divisions could keep pressing forward. The skies over Europe in late 1944 revealed a truth the Germans refused to admit. Logistics wins wars. And in logistics, the Allies were untouchable. One of the hidden strengths of the American system wasn't just trucks, planes, or fuel. It was flexibility. In the U.S. Army, authority often flowed downward, giving sergeants and junior officers the power to make decisions on the spot. A convoy commander didn't need to wait for approval from some distant headquarters. If a bridge was blown, if a road was jammed, if enemy fire blocked the way, sergeants were expected to improvise and keep moving. That kind of trust in the lower ranks was revolutionary compared to the German system. In the Wehrmacht, logistics remained rigid and hierarchical. A colonel might spend hours waiting for permission to reroute supplies, even if the need was obvious. Every decision climbed a ladder of command, and by the time it came back down, opportunities were lost. German efficiency was real, but it was also brittle, a machine that broke down when conditions changed too quickly. The Americans thrived in chaos. Drivers rerouted themselves, officers cut new paths, and mechanics scavenged spare parts on the fly. Soldiers joked that Red Ball convoys never stopped, they just found another way forward. Flexibility was not just tolerated, it was demanded. And in a war where roads were bombed, weather unpredictable, and enemies desperate, that adaptability often made the difference between success and failure. Patton himself encouraged it. His mantra was speed, aggression, and momentum. He didn't care if supply sergeants bent rules, as long as the fuel reached the tanks and the ammo reached the guns. That culture filtered down to every driver in the Red Ball Express. Men who, back home, had been farmers, truckers, or mechanics were suddenly making split-second calls that shaped the advance of entire divisions. For the Germans, it was unthinkable. Colonels followed orders, sergeants followed rules, and innovation was left for higher command. In 1944, that rigidity slowed them down. The Americans, by contrast, turned flexibility into a weapon. The Red Ball Express didn't just move supplies. It moved faster because every man in the system was trusted to act, adapt, and win. Behind the roar of engines and the thunder of convoys was a truth often overlooked. The Red Ball Express was built on the shoulders of African American soldiers. More than 75% of its drivers were black men, serving in a segregated army that rarely gave them the chance to fight in combat roles. Instead, they were assigned to transportation units, a role many at the time dismissed as unglamorous. But in reality, they became the backbone of one of the most important operations of the entire war. These men faced a cruel irony. At home in the United States, segregation and discrimination denied them basic rights. In the military, they were often treated as second-class soldiers, barred from frontline glory. Yet when Europe's future depended on logistics, it was these very men who carried the weight. Day and night, they drove the convoys, navigating dangerous roads under constant threat from German air attacks, ambushes, or simply the exhaustion that came from endless miles behind the wheel. Many of these drivers had never imagined themselves as heroes. They were truckers, farmers, mechanics, ordinary men thrust into extraordinary responsibility. With minimal rest, they guided heavily loaded trucks across narrow, bomb-cratered roads, often with no headlights, relying only on the dim glow of the vehicle ahead. Their courage wasn't measured in firefights or medals, but in persistence, keeping the lifeline moving when failure was not an option. And they paid a price. Accidents were common. Fatigue was relentless, and recognition was rare. Few outside the convoys ever saw the sacrifices they made. But Patton's Third Army knew the truth. Without these drivers, his tanks would have run dry. The Red Ball Express was not just a feat of logistics. It was a testament to the grit and determination of black soldiers who fought prejudice at home and carried victory abroad. In later years, veterans of the Red Ball would recall the pride they felt. Though denied the spotlight in 1944, history has revealed their role. They weren't just part of the system. They were the system. The beating heart of the supply chain was powered by their hands, their courage, and their will to keep moving forward. In the autumn of 1944, as the Red Ball Express roared at full speed, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower made a visit to see the operation with his own eyes. He expected to find trucks, fuel drums, and endless convoys. What he hadn't fully realized was the human cost of keeping that system alive. When Eisenhower walked among the convoys, he didn't just see machines. He saw men, black drivers, their uniforms stained with grease and dust, slumped against their trucks, barely able to stand. Some had been behind the wheel for 20 hours straight, pushing themselves past the limits of exhaustion. Their eyes were bloodshot, their hands blistered from gripping the wheel, and yet, when ordered to move out again, they climbed back and without hesitation. The Supreme Commander, a man known for his calm composure, was visibly shaken. Here were soldiers who had been denied combat roles, segregated by policy, and often overlooked by history, yet they were carrying the Allied advance on their backs. Without them, the front line would have starved of fuel and supplies. Eisenhower understood it instantly. Looking at those men, he admitted with rare emotion, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry." For the drivers, that acknowledgement meant more than medals or parades. It was a recognition from the highest authority in the Allied command that their sacrifice mattered. They weren't just truck drivers. They were warriors in their own right, fighting with endurance, grit, and wheels instead of rifles. The irony was profound. Many of these men would return home after the war to face the same segregation and discrimination they had left behind. But on those roads in France, in that moment, their contribution could not be denied. They weren't just supporting the fight, they were making victory possible. Eisenhower's words have echoed across the decades as a testament to their service. The Red Ball Express may have been a logistical operation, but for the men who drove it, especially those exhausted, unsung black drivers, it was nothing less than a battle fought mile by mile, with the outcome of the war hanging in the balance. The Red Ball Express may have looked unstoppable from a distance, but for the men inside those trucks, every mile carried danger, accidents, fatigue, enemy air raids, and mechanical breakdowns turned each journey into a gamble with fate. The convoys didn't move along smooth highways. They rattled across crittered roads, mud-slick paths, and temporary bridges that creaked under the weight of overloaded vehicles. Fatigue was the constant enemy. Drivers pushed through endless hours with little rest, their eyelids heavy, minds dulled by monotony. Some men simply couldn't fight it any longer. Trucks swerved off the road as exhausted soldiers fell asleep at the wheel, sometimes with fatal consequences. Others risked collision when the convoy ahead slowed unexpectedly, because stopping in the middle of a red ball column wasn't allowed. The lifeline had to keep moving, no matter what. And then came the Luftwaffe. Though weakened, German aircraft still hunted the convoys. Drivers were called diving for ditches as strafing runs tore through the roads, trucks exploding into fireballs. Even without enemy planes, mechanical breakdowns were a daily hazard. Engines overheated, tires blew out, and transmissions failed under the strain of non-stop driving. Yet every breakdown put not just supplies, but lives at risk. Stalled trucks made perfect targets, and recovery crews had to work fast under fire. The courage of the drivers often turned into acts of quiet heroism. Stories spread of men refusing to abandon their loads, even when their vehicles caught fire. Some drove burning trucks off the road to prevent explosions from killing others in the convoy. Others stayed behind to tow crippled vehicles to safety, knowing full well they could be strafed or shelled at any moment. There was no glamour in this fight, no medals for bravery, no glory in history books at the time. Only the knowledge that their sacrifice kept Patton's army moving. For the drivers, each trip was a battle against exhaustion, machinery, and enemy fire. For the war effort, every trip was victory on wheels. The risks were constant, but so was their determination. German shock for German soldiers. Capture often came with shock. They had braced themselves to fight American tanks and infantry, but nothing prepared them for the sight of American supply lines. Prisoners of war, marched to holding camps along French roads, stood in stunned silence as they watched the Red Ball Express thunder past. Convoy after convoy stretched beyond the horizon. The Germans had expected a few trucks supplying each division, just as their own army operated. Instead, they saw rivers of vehicles, thousands of them, moving with relentless precision. The sound was overwhelming, a mechanical drumbeat that never stopped, day or night. To men raised on the myth of German efficiency, it was a crushing blow to morale. Some prisoners whispered in disbelief. One account tells of a captured German officer staring at the endless columns and muttering, "We cannot defeat a nation with more trucks than we have soldiers." It wasn't hyperbole. By late 1944, the United States was producing vehicles faster than Germany could produce rifles. What the prisoners were witnessing wasn't just transportation. It was the physical embodiment of industrial war, a reminder that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire nation's factories, farms, and workers, all united in a single, unstoppable effort. For the Americans, the convoys became routine. For the Germans, they were psychological warfare. Every Red Ball truck that roared past told the enemy, "You are outmatched." Not just here, but everywhere. It was a silent but undeniable message of inevitability. Many POs later admitted that it was the supply system, not the tanks or guns, that convinced them the war was lost. Panzer divisions could be rebuilt, lines could be redrawn, but no amount of training or courage could match the sheer scale of American logistics. The Red Ball Express wasn't only fueling Patton's advance, it was fueling despair in the hearts of his enemies. In the end, the convoys were more than lifelines for the Allies. They were rolling symbols of victory, so vast that even the enemy, watching helplessly, understood that the war had already slipped beyond Germany's grasp. The front lines at night were supposed to be quiet, just the wind, the occasional artillery, and the nervous whispers of men trying to rest before the next attack. But by late 1944, silence was gone. From miles away, a new sound filled the darkness, the constant growl of engines, hundreds, sometimes thousands, rumbling through the French countryside. It was the Red Ball Express. German soldiers lying in foxholes would turn their heads, straining to listen. The trucks never seemed to end. Hour after hour, all night long, the convoys rolled east. To the men on the ground, it felt as if the road itself had become alive with machines. An iron river carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and hope for the Allies. At first, the Germans thought it was an exaggeration. Surely no army could maintain such traffic without pause. But then came the realization. The sound never stopped because the trucks never stopped. American logistics didn't sleep. Day and night, rain or shine, the convoys rolled on, supplying Patton's tanks with a tempo the Wehrmacht simply could not match. The psychological effect was devastating. German diaries described the noise as endless thunder, a reminder that they faced not just an enemy army, but an enemy with limitless resources. Some reported hearing ghost convoys, phantom truck engines even when no vehicles were present. The sound haunted their imaginations, gnawing at morale, convincing them they were already beaten. For soldiers who had grown up believing in German superiority, it was humiliating. How could their vaunted military machine be undone not by tanks or aircraft, but by convoys of trucks? The answer was simple. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon, and every rumbling engine in the night was proof. By the time the Red Ball Express reached its peak, German soldiers no longer feared just American firepower. They feared the sound of trucks in the dark, carrying with them the realization that they were fighting against an enemy who could outproduce, outsupply, and outlast them at every turn. The roar of engines became more than noise. It was the soundtrack of German defeat. Winter was supposed to be the great equalizer. For centuries, armies had been stopped by snow, ice, and bitter cold. Napoleon's men froze on the march to Moscow. Hitler's panzers stalled in the Russian winter. And by late 1944, German doctrine insisted that wheeled transport simply could not function below -10 degrees Celsius. In such conditions, trucks were useless, roads were frozen traps, and supply lines would inevitably collapse. But the Red Ball Express didn't stop. When the icy winds swept across France and Belgium, thousands of American drivers chained up their tires, smashed frozen mud from wheel wells, and poured alcohol into radiators to keep engines from seizing. The convoys slowed from 35 miles an hour to just 15, but they kept moving. Imagine the scene, endless lines of trucks creeping through blizzards, headlights dimmed, engines coughing in the cold, drivers gripping the wheel with numb fingers. Some men wrapped themselves in every scrap of cloth they could find, blankets, scarves, even parachute silk, just to keep from freezing in open cabs. Accidents were constant. Trucks skidded off icy roads, jackknifed on hills, or overturned into ditches. Mechanics worked in sleet and snow, bare hands on frozen steel, just to keep convoys alive. And yet, the tonnage still reached the front. Fuel for Patton's tanks, ammunition for artillery, medical supplies for the wounded. Even in the worst conditions nature could offer, the Red Ball Express refused to break. German observers were stunned. Their own manuals had told them this was impossible, that no army could maintain wheeled supply in such weather. But the Americans had done it not through elegance or efficiency, but through raw determination and endless resources. By the winter of 1944-45, it was no longer just about trucks. It was about willpower. Every convoy that forced its way across an icy French road told the Germans one thing: the Americans were not going to stop. The Red Ball Express had turned whether an ancient ally of defending armies into nothing more than another obstacle, to be rolled over at 15 miles per hour. In just 82 days, the Red Ball Express burned through nearly 5,000 trucks. Engines blew, transmissions failed, tires shredded, and countless vehicles were abandoned on the sides of French roads. To any other army, this would have been a disaster. Losing thousands of trucks in such a short time should have crippled supply lines and left frontline units stranded. But for the United States, it barely registered as a setback. Behind every Red Ball convoy was the power of Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. American factories were working around the clock, producing trucks faster than the Germans could possibly destroy them. At its peak, U.S. industry was rolling out 6,000 new vehicles every single week. Every truck worn out in France could be replaced in days, not months. This was the true miracle of the Red Ball Express, not just the bravery of the drivers on the road, but the industrial machine at their backs. Germany, by contrast, was collapsing under shortages. They built sleek, powerful tanks like the Panther and Tiger, but they could only afford to make a few hundred a month. Trucks were even worse. Germany relied on horse-drawn wagons for nearly half its supply transport. While German soldiers rationed bullets and fuel, Patton's army rolled east with endless convoys of fresh vehicles, spare parts, and gasoline. The Germans could blow up bridges, mine roads, even bomb convoys. But they couldn't keep up with American production. For every truck that broke down or went up in flames, another one was already on the way from a U.S. port. One German officer later admitted with disbelief, "We destroyed 50 American trucks. Within a week, they had replaced them. We repaired ours for months. They simply built new ones." The Red Ball Express didn't just wear out men and machines on the road, it wore out Germany's hope of ever regaining control. Because in modern war, it wasn't enough to destroy what the enemy had. Against American industry, you had to destroy what the enemy could build next. And that was impossible. While the Red Ball Express thundered down the highways, another battle was being quietly won by American engineers, one of steel, gravel, and sweat. Thousands of miles of French railways had been destroyed by retreating German forces, leaving craters, twisted tracks, and demolished bridges in their wake. Without these rail lines, the long-term supply chain for advancing Allied armies would have collapsed, and the momentum of Patton's armored divisions would have stalled. American railroad engineers, working in tandem with the truck convoys, tackled this destruction with astonishing speed and ingenuity. They didn't just patch holes, they rebuilt entire sections of track, sometimes laying more than a mile of new railway in a single day. Using captured German equipment alongside American machinery, they restored rail connections faster than the Germans could tear them down. Cranes lifted wrecked rail cars, crews welded rails over shattered ties, and convoys of men hauled ballast and supplies under the constant threat of enemy fire. This dual system of trucks and rail was not simply redundancy, it was a calculated strategy. While trucks delivered urgent fuel, ammunition, and rations directly to the front lines, repaired railways allowed bulk supplies to flow from ports to staging areas far behind the combat zones. It was a logistical symphony, highways and railroads working together to create a supply chain that seemed unstoppable. German observers could hardly comprehend the scale and speed of the operation. They had studied European warfare and assumed armies could only move as fast as their rail lines allowed. Yet here was the Americans, rewriting the rules. If a railway was destroyed, it was rebuilt almost immediately. If a convoy broke down, another truck was already on the way. The combination of relentless manpower, mechanical skill, and industrial capacity made the supply lines virtually invincible. By ensuring that the supply chain never broke, American engineers didn't just support an army, they enabled a continuous advance that kept the German forces off balance. Every mile of repaired track reinforced the Red Ball Express, allowing it to operate at peak efficiency for weeks on end. In essence, the engineers were as crucial to victory as the soldiers and drivers. Without them, the convoys would have stalled, tanks would have run dry, and the Allies' momentum might have faltered. Their work transformed destruction into opportunity and showcased that in modern warfare, rebuilding faster than the enemy can destroy is as decisive as any battle. In just 82 days, the Red Ball Express achieved what German planners had deemed impossible. Over this short period, American trucks hauled more than 412,000 tons of vital supplies, fuel, ammunition, rations, medical gear across France, keeping Patton's army fueled, fed, and fighting. To put it in perspective, that's enough material to fill thousands of freight trains. Yet it all moved along a single, carefully orchestrated highway system. The trucks didn't just cover distance, they transported an astonishing 122 million ton-miles. Every mile traveled multiplied the impact of the supply effort, ensuring that no armored division ever ran out of fuel and no infantry unit lacked food or medical support. German commanders, accustomed to European logistics where supply lines were fragile and rationing strict, could not comprehend such scale. They had planned for Americans to advance cautiously, assuming that their forces would eventually outrun supplies. Instead, every day, the Red Ball Express proved them wrong. Numbers alone tell part of the story, but the human effort behind them is even more remarkable. Nearly 23,000 drivers, many of them young African American soldiers, operated in extreme conditions: long hours, freezing rain, mechanical failures, and enemy attacks. Convoys ran 24 hours a day, with drivers pushing through fatigue, snow, and ice. They didn't just transport goods. They carried the momentum of an entire campaign. Each delivery was a lifeline, keeping tanks moving, guns firing, and soldiers alive. For the Germans, the sheer volume and speed were demoralizing. Even when convoys were slowed by weather or mechanical issues, replacements were ready and supply never stopped. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a logistics operation, it was a demonstration of industrial might, human endurance, and tactical flexibility. By moving hundreds of thousands of tons across hundreds of miles, Americans rewrote the rules of modern warfare. Victory would now be determined, not only by tanks or planes, but by who could move the most supplies, fastest, and farthest. In short, the Red Ball Express turned numbers into strategy, turning logistical superiority into battlefield dominance. The Germans, staring at these impossible statistics, realized that they weren't just facing an army, they were facing an unstoppable supply machine. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most respected commanders, reflected on the Allied advance with a startling admission: "We were not defeated by American tanks or planes. We were defeated by American trucks." At first glance, it sounds almost absurd. After all, tanks and planes are the instruments of war, the weapons that dominate battlefields. But Model's insight goes far deeper. He recognized that the true power behind Patton's unstoppable advance was not in armored divisions or fighter squadrons, but in the logistical machine that fed, fueled, and sustained them. The Red Ball Express, operating with thousands of trucks and tens of thousands of drivers, created a supply chain that German planners could not disrupt. Every day, fuel, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies flowed toward the front lines in massive volumes. Even when convoys were slowed by ice, snow, mechanical failures, or enemy action, replacements and repairs were immediate. German calculations, based on traditional European warfare, assumed that the Americans would be forced to ration, delay, or halt their advance when supply lines stretched too thin. Instead, the Red Ball Express moved relentlessly, making those assumptions laughably outdated. Model's statement also underscores the psychological impact of logistics in modern warfare. German officers and soldiers watched in disbelief as endless convoys of trucks stretched beyond the horizon, rolling day and night. They saw fuel delivered to Patton's tanks before they ran dry, ammunition reaching front lines faster than it could be used, and medical supplies saving soldiers who would otherwise have died. The Germans realized that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome this constant, overwhelming flow of resources. Victory had shifted from battlefield maneuvers to the ability to sustain an army through industrial-scale logistics. Ultimately, Model's quote captures the revolutionary lesson of the Red Ball Express. In the industrial age, logistics is not supported as strategy. Tanks, planes, and infantry can win battles, but a nation that can supply its forces faster, farther, and more consistently than its enemy will ultimately determine the outcome of war. For the Germans, it was a bitter revelation that the hum of thousands of engines, not the roar of cannons, spelled their defeat. The story of the Red Ball Express didn't end when the war did. Thousands of men who had driven, repaired, and coordinated the massive convoys returned home carrying a wealth of experience in logistics, transportation, and organizational skill. For many, this knowledge became the foundation of post-war America's booming transportation industry. Veterans founded trucking companies, applied the lessons of moving massive quantities of supplies quickly, and innovated methods to keep vehicles running continuously over long distances. The principles of volume, speed, and redundancy that had kept Patton's armored divisions supplied became the backbone of modern freight transport. Their influence extended even further. The U.S. interstate highway system, one of the largest infrastructure projects in history, benefited directly from the insights these veterans gained during the war. They knew what made convoys efficient, how to design routes for maximum throughput, and how to maintain vehicles across thousands of miles. Techniques for route management, supply coordination, and mechanical support were adapted from wartime logistics to civilian commerce. The roads they helped plan and the trucking networks they established transformed America's economy, connecting cities, enabling trade, and creating the modern logistics networks we rely on today. In many ways, the Red Ball Express was a training ground not just for war, but for the industrial and commercial success of post-war America. The lessons of speed over perfection, redundancy over efficiency, and relentless forward momentum were carried from European battlefields to American highways. The veterans turned their wartime experience into peacetime progress, proving that the skills honed in the most extreme circumstances of modern warfare could reshape society. The Red Ball Express didn't just win battles, it helped build the infrastructure that continues to move the nation today. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a feat of military logistics, it was a demonstration of how a free, industrial democracy could outproduce and outmaneuver a rigid, totalitarian system. German commanders had spent years perfecting hierarchy, control, and disciplined efficiency. Every decision was centralized, every action measured against doctrine. In contrast, the Americans operated with decentralization, flexibility, and sheer industrial might. Junior officers and even sergeants made critical decisions on the fly, improvising solutions and keeping convoys moving under impossible conditions. The German model prized precision and order, but the Red Ball Express proved that in modern warfare, speed, adaptability, and redundancy often matter more than perfect execution. American industry amplified this advantage. Factories produced thousands of trucks, engines, and spare parts faster than the Germans could destroy them. When trucks broke down, replacements were immediately available. When roads were damaged, engineers rebuilt them faster than they could be torn up. The Americans accepted waste as a necessary cost for speed, something unimaginable to the German military mind. This industrial abundance, combined with decentralized decision-making, created a logistics machine that German planners couldn't even conceptualize, let alone counter. Moreover, the operation highlighted a cultural difference in problem-solving. While the Germans relied on strict procedures and chain-of-command approvals, American drivers, mechanics, and officers acted independently to meet the mission's goals. If a truck caught fire or a convoy got stuck in ice, they improvised solutions, often risking their lives to keep supplies moving. The result was a relentless, unstoppable flow of resources that powered Patton's armored divisions across France. In the end, the Red Ball Express didn't just deliver fuel, ammo, and rations, it delivered a stark lesson. In the industrial age, freedom combined with resources and ingenuity can outperform control combined with rigid discipline. German officers, watching endless convoys of trucks, realized too late that hierarchy and control could not match initiative and production. The Red Ball Express proved that modern warfare rewards those who can think fast, produce faster, and act without waiting for orders, a lesson that resonates far beyond the battlefield. The Red Ball Express proved a revolutionary truth about modern warfare. Battles aren't won solely on the front lines, they're won in the supply lines. For centuries, military success was measured by tactics, the bravery of soldiers, or the effectiveness of tanks and planes. But in 1944, a new reality emerged. Patton's armored divisions didn't advance simply because of superior strategy, they moved because thousands of trucks, manned by dedicated drivers, carried fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies non-stop across liberated France. Without this constant stream, even the best-equipped divisions would have stalled, powerless against both the enemy and the clock. Logistics, long considered a support function, became the main effort. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that the ability to sustain an army over long distances, in any weather, under constant enemy threat, could determine the outcome of a campaign more decisively than any tank or fighter plane. German commanders, trained to measure military power in terms of tanks and divisions, were stunned. Endless convoys of trucks, stretching beyond the horizon, shattered their assumptions. They realized too late that industrial production and efficient, flexible supply systems could overwhelm even the most disciplined and battle-hardened forces. Every day, trucks roared across France, delivering tens of thousands of tons of supplies. When vehicles broke down or roads were destroyed, engineers and drivers improvised instantly, replacing broken parts, repairing roads, or chaining tires to navigate ice and snow. The Germans, rigidly adhering to doctrine, could not keep up. The Americans' combination of resource abundance, decentralized decision-making, and relentless determination made logistics itself a weapon of war, a weapon that powered victories, shortened campaigns, and ultimately contributed to the collapse of German resistance. The lesson was clear: in modern warfare, the army with the best supply lines often prevails over the army with the best tactics. The Red Ball Express transformed the understanding of strategy, proving that in the industrial age, logistics isn't just support, it is the battlefield. The Germans had prepared for American tanks, planes, and ships, but they never prepared for American trucks. Day after day, convoy after convoy. The Red Ball Express drowned the Wehrmacht in Allied abundance. The Red Ball Express wasn't elegant. It wasn't efficient. But it worked and it won the war. Thousands of young drivers, many of them African American, carried victory on their wheels at 35 miles per hour. If you found this story of forgotten heroes and game-changing logistics fascinating, make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history fans, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of World War II. Because history isn't just about battles fought, it's about the systems, the people, and the sacrifices that made victory possible.